Matthew chapter 6. Therefore, I tell you, says Jesus, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to their life? It's a pretty powerful paragraph. There's a lot of do not statements in the Sermon on the Mount. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not announce your giving with trumpets. And on all those statements, I feel pretty good about myself. I kind of crushed it this week on those do nots. But when we get to Matthew 6 and Jesus says, do not worry about your life, I think, ooh, I blew it. This is so hard. Because worry, as you know, it's like breathing. It's just everywhere. You can't escape it. In fact, I made a list of things that I worry about, things that you worry about. See if anything on this list resonates with you. We worry about what to say to a friend when we have to confront that friend or have a hard conversation. We worry about what to cook when company is coming over. We worry about that niggle that we feel in our body that we assume will go away, but then it doesn't go away, and then we're not sure if we should call the doctor or not. We worry about the sickness that cannot be diagnosed. We worry about the presentation that we have to give tomorrow. Maybe you worry about the AP biology test coming up, or about the amount of reading you have to do for a class. We worry about our children. We worry about our children's health and confidence and social lives and spiritual lives. We worry about our friends, our hair, our bodies, our appearance, our weight, our insecurity, and our future. We worry that someone is going to find out just how inadequate we actually feel. We worry about inflation, loneliness, aging, retirement, adulting, safety, terrorism, war, COVID, earthquakes, elections, and how long Phil's sermons will actually last. Did I cover everyone? I mean, it's everywhere. Of course, it's just worry is part of life. And yet these words from Jesus are real. He says, don't worry. So what do? We're disciples of Jesus. We're following our rabbi this year as he says, follow me. And so I know many of us, we want to get better at this. How do you actually do this? This is really hard. Well, two things to say at the outset. Number one, I am using the word anxiety today. It's a big umbrella word. I'm talking about general anxiety that pretty much every human being experiences. There's another kind of anxiety, which is what I would call clinical anxiety, which is really more or less outlined with guidelines in the DSM-5. And if that's you, then what I'm going to say today might be helpful, but it's not going to solve everything that is going on in your life. If you have clinical anxiety, I'd encourage you to find the right professionals, get the right help, get medicine, or whatever you need. We're holistic beings and must be treated as such. And I would also say if you struggle with clinical anxiety, don't feel bad about this message. You might have the tendency to get to the end of this message and think, well, I'm never going to make it. I just can't get rid of my anxiety. Be gentle on yourself. I'm just addressing general anxiety that most human beings have. Second, just general observation before we start hopping into more truth and content. It's really easy to look at these words from Jesus, don't worry about your life, and assume that they're hyperbole. Jesus can't mean that. I mean, he's just setting a high bar, but surely he must know that that is impossible. Well, not so fast. Think about Jesus' original audience. Who's he talking to in the Sermon on the Mount? He's talking to the people that he's already described in the Beatitudes as the poor in spirit and those who mourn and the meek and the persecuted. So he's talking to a very downtrodden group of people. These are people that they spend their days plowing their fields, and they're scraping by for dinner. Many nights they're going to bed hungry, and they're having to pay taxes to Rome. Like this is really, really difficult. So Jesus didn't say this line, "Don't worry about your life," he wasn't saying this originally to 21st century Americans who get stressed out because they can't find their phone charger. He was saying this to people worried that they might starve to death. And I only bring that up, actually, I'm trying to make a hopeful point here. If Jesus believes that his original audience could be worry-free, or at least worry less, then most certainly he would believe that you and me, even with our busy, stressful lives, I think he truly believes that we could live a stress-free, or at least a stress-less, less anxiety kind of life. So how do you do that? Let's hop into some of these passages here. I want to drill into a few parts of the text. First, I want to look at verse 27. So in verse 27, Jesus says, "Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" The point here is that worry does not make a contribution to the flourishing of life. Like, it has no inherent value. It doesn't help you move forward on any project that you might have. Worry by definition is a negation. It's taking away. So worry does for your life what junk mail does for your inbox. Like, you're going through your email and you just have all this, like, why is this here? I keep unsubscribing. Why I keep blocking this? Why? It has no value for your inbox, and it's just there. Well, that's the point Jesus is making here. It doesn't help you. You're not going to add a single hour to your life if you worry. Or, like, if you could take all of your anxiety in a given year and quantify it or put it in a bottle and then try to sell that bottle on eBay, it would go for $0. There's no value. It doesn't contribute to any part of your life. Now, it's real. I'm not saying it's not real. It just has no real value. So anytime, and this is going to sound like a cliche, and I don't mean it to be that way, but anytime you can exchange anxiety for action, you want to take that trade, because action actually does something. Here's another truth from this text. We're going to skip down to the very end, verse 34. Jesus says, "Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." Really brilliant ending to this passage. So what's the point here? Max Lucado writes about this, and I really appreciate Lucado's language. So he makes the observation at this point and says, God will help you deal with whatever hard things come up when the time comes. And I love that thought, because sometimes when I'm anxious, I'm trying to get myself ready for something that hasn't happened yet. Oh, what if she says this? Or what if this happens? Or, oh no, what if this goes wrong? Well, that's not there yet. Or I've got this thing coming up in 2 months or 3 months. Or I've got this conversation. It's not there. So I can't deal with that yet because it doesn't exist. And so Lucado says, well, God will help you. It'll just happen when you need it, when the time comes. And so, in fact, Lucado goes on to explain even further. He says, I don't know what I'm going to do if my husband dies. Well, you will when the time comes. Well, when my children leave the house, I don't think I can take it. Well, it won't be easy, but strength will arrive when the time comes. The key is this: meet today's problems with today's strength. Don't start tackling tomorrow's problems until tomorrow, because you don't have tomorrow's strength yet. You simply have enough strength for today. It's a brilliant thought. In fact, sometimes when I'm read the Lord's Prayer and I get to the give us this day our daily bread part, I think, wow, do we really need to pray that? Like for us in our culture, we've got refrigerators and cupboards and we have so much food. Well, sometimes I think the principle there is there are certain things you do need to pray for every day. Now, in the ancient world, they didn't know if they were going to get a meal, so they'd pray for bread. For us, sometimes what we have to pray for is the daily strength. Well, you don't have your strength for tomorrow yet because you only have what you have for today. That's Lucato's point here. Okay, third truth. I'm going to dive a little longer into a really interesting line. So verse 26, Jesus says, look at the birds of the air. Now, when he says this, it's an illustration. He's just said, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or drink. Don't worry about your body, what you will wear. And then he says, look at the birds. So he means, for example, just for an experiment, though, let's treat this verse as if it's a direct command. Look at the birds. So let's take a minute and let's look at some birds. I actually meant to bring a hat. I'm going to become your zookeeper for just a few minutes here, and we're going to take a look at some birds. So first bird we're going to look at, this is called the bee hummingbird. I feel like I should have an Australian accent, and I actually practiced that a little bit, but now that I'm up here on the stage, I don't really think you want to deal with that, so I'm not going to do that. This is the bee hummingbird. It's the smallest bird in the world. It's about the size of your pinky finger, and it's called the bee hummingbird because it's often mistaken for a bee. Very good. Now, on the opposite end of things, we have the biggest bird in the world, which is, anybody have a guess? The ostrich. So this ostrich, ostriches can be taller than Goliath. They can weigh more than Shaquille O'Neal. So if you were to be caught in a pen with an ostrich, this would not be the best day of your life. Massive, massive bird. Can't fly, a big bird. Here's another really interesting bird. This is the bird to have the most headaches in the world. Just kidding. It is called the swordbill bird, and it's got the longest bill in the world in proportion to his body. I think a better title would be Pinocchio, but isn't that a really interesting looking bird? Now, you don't have to travel very far for these next few birds. You can go in your backyard, and you can see all these. You got cardinals, you got blue jays, you got sparrows. I mean, surely you've had a moment where you looked in your backyard and you thought, wow, like it's just sitting right there. There's so much delight in the colors. Like there really is something about just looking at these birds. Or here's another one. You have to go to Cuba for this. This is the Cuban toady. Oh, that's the eagle. Raise your hand if you've ever seen an eagle. Who's seen an eagle in their life? It's so mesmerizing when you actually see one of these things. Then if you go to Cuba, you would see this one called the Cuban toady. And the interesting thing about this bird is it has the highest feeding rate of all birds. It eats 1,500 insects a day. It's pretty impressive. Now here's my favorite one and the last one. My new favorite bird is this. It's the Arctic tern. And the reason this bird is so cool is because every year in about July, he and his buddies, they gather pretty near the top of planet Earth, around the North Pole, just a few miles off the North Pole. And then they start the longest migration of any creature on Earth. You know where they migrate to? Antarctica. Yes, they fly the course of the entire planet. So they go past Greenland and then past Iceland, and then they go down the coasts of either North South America or Europe and then Africa, jump the ocean, and they land on these icebergs in Antarctica. They fish for a few months, and then they turn around and they do the whole thing backwards. And they have no passports. They have no GPS. They eat no granola bars. They fly 60,000 miles a year. Now, while all this is happening, what are we doing? Well, we're worried about the style of our clothing. Just odd. Okay, so what's the point? Like, why are we talking about birds? For most people, you talk about birds and they would say, okay, that was unproductive. Like, we got nothing done the last few minutes. We didn't make any money. We got no things checked off our to-do list. This was kind of boring. Like, there's nothing as insignificant and inconsequential as looking at and talking about birds. Why did we talk about birds, Phil? Who in their right mind would look at birds? Jesus would, actually. Jesus says, look at the birds, not because it's some theory that he has. He's not quoting a field manual. Oh, let's turn to Pilate's parrots. And what is he? No. Jesus is speaking from experience. Look at the birds. He says this because he has done this. So you ever look at a famous person and wonder what they're thinking? So you see a president or a CEO or just some really high executive and they're walking around. You think, wow, it must be really hard to be him. Must be hard to be her. Wonder what she's thinking about all day long. The burdens that she has to carry. You ever just thought, what do these famous and really important people think about? Well, what did Jesus think about? I mean, first of all, to set the context, you've got Pharisees want to trap him. Satan wants to tempt him and wants to destroy him. The Romans want to kill him. Masses of miracle-hungry people want to mob him. And then daily he's faced with the reality that he's going to die this horrific death by crucifixion. And what's he thinking about? Birds. And flowers. Of which he says in the Sermon on the Mount, not even Solomon in all of his splendor was dressed like one of these. Well, how does Jesus know that the flowers are prettier than Solomon's glory and temple? He doesn't know that because someone gave him a report. Jesus, the tulips are looking really good today. I think they're looking a little bit better than Solomon's temple. No! Jesus thinks flowers are really pretty and amazing and beautiful because he looks at them. He looks at the birds, he looks at flowers. Okay, so what am I saying? What is the point here? Jesus had more to be anxious about than anybody else. And yet he kept that anxiety at bay by delighting in the goodness of God's creation. Like, he had so much to be stressed out about. People hated him. Every day he was dealing with critic after critic and ignorant disciples. Like, he had so much to be stressed out about. He didn't have a regular home. He didn't have a regular income. And yet he kept the anxiety at bay because he made this decision: I'm going to focus on the goodness of God, just like we sang about. N.T. Wright makes this great observation. He says, of course, Jesus has times when he's sad, Gethsemane, Lazarus' tomb. But for the most part, Jesus is buoyant, pleasant, happy. He has friends. He gets invited to weddings. He gets invited to parties. He carries himself with this radiance despite having the weight of the world on his shoulders. How does he do that? It's a choice. He's made this decision that he's going to focus on the goodness of God. Like, you don't hear Jesus say, look at Judas, what a punk. Look at Peter, what a loudmouth. Look at Thomas, what a doubter. Look at Nicodemus, he didn't even have the courage to see me in the daylight. Look at our lodging tonight. Look at this ungrateful leper. Now, all those things are true. I mean, Jesus had a really hard life. He didn't know where his next meal was coming from. He lived in poverty. And yet he says, we're going to look at the birds today. It was a choice. So here's another truth for you. Contentment is a matter of attention. It's what you choose to look at. If we were to bring onto the stage the most content person on earth, and we were to sit him or her in this chair and talk to this person, what do you think would emerge from that conversation? Let's say, for example, I handed this person a questionnaire, a life questionnaire. I said, would you fill this out, please? And then he or she hands the questionnaire back to me, and I read it to you. What do you think would be on the life questionnaire? Well, I guarantee you there'd be health problems, probably be money problems. This person would likely have some conflict, maybe with a friend or an in-law, or some member of their Bible class. Very likely this person would have had someone pass away recently in their life, and they'd be somewhat sad about that. Like, it's a normal person. And so what would it be about this person? Why would they be the most content person on earth? Well, it's because they'd make a choice. They have made a choice to focus on the goodness of God rather than the unfairness of life. See, every single day for the rest of your life, you're going to wake up with problems. Like, there's never a Friday coming where you wake up and think, oh, it's all over. My body's perfect. All my relationships are great. All the money I need is just there. I have purpose and meaning today. Wow, my problems are gone. That's never going to happen. And yet you can live a life of contentment. How do you do that? It's something you learn. It's a learned behavior. You see, anxiety does not derive from problems. Anxiety derives from habit. We have trained our minds to fester over the things that we don't like. For years, we have done this. Oh, I don't like this, and I don't like, why is this, and what am I going to do about it? We're just training ourselves to be anxious. And yet Jesus comes along as someone who has potential to have more anxiety than anybody that has ever existed. And he carries himself freely and lightly because he's learned it. It's a behavior, it's a practice. And so you can learn this. Like, you learned your way into being an anxious person, you can unlearn your way out of being an anxious person. Even for those of you that would say, I get sure maybe this works for somebody, but not for me. You don't realize what I have going on in my life. And I get what you're saying, but again, I know I'm repeating myself, but just think about this. Jesus had to endure the hell of crucifixion, and yet he called that burden in Matthew 11 light. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. You can learn to live this kind of a life. And for just a minute, I know it's hard to think about how to do this, but can you imagine the impact it would have on you and your circle of influence if you could learn the non-anxious life? Oh, just think about the people around you, how much of a difference it would make to them. So where do you start? Three quick thoughts, and I realize that it's very complicated. It's not like this solves everything, but 3 quick things you can do. Number 1, you can notice your anxious thoughts. The earlier, the better. If you can cut off an anxious thought 30 seconds into it rather than 3 hours later, be in a lot better shape. So notice your thoughts. Number 2, replace them. This is what Jesus does. Look at the birds. He replaces potential anxiety with the goodness of God. So you think about creation, think about Scripture, you read your Bible, you say a prayer, you go spend time with a friend that really blesses you. You learn to replace the anxious thought. And then number 3, you share it. And this is so important. One of the great casualties of our individualistic culture is that we are all taught to carry our burdens by ourselves. But you can't do that. You're not an island. We have to relearn the practice of sharing burdens with one another, and this is not a selfish thing. It's not selfish at all. Because someday you're going to be the one to respond to someone else's anxiety. We have to learn to share. And very specifically, I want to encourage you to share your burdens with your elders. We've got 25 shepherds of this congregation, and they care so deeply about you. I get the privilege of sitting in their meetings twice a month, and a lot of what they do in their meetings is pray for you. They talk about you, and they go to the Father on your behalf because they care so deeply about you. In fact, I want to tell you the second shift we're going to make for our invitation time. So remember, first shift is, as best you can, I'd love you to stay in the room to honor the people that are receiving something from the Lord. The second shift is, we're going to have our shepherds start to be the primary people to receive people for prayer. And that's going to happen in the back and not the front. So sometimes it is hard when you're coming forward to prayer to feel the spotlight of the room. You can feel anxious about that. And so for a while, we're going to experiment with, there's going to be a shepherd at each exit, and they're there to receive you and pray for you in the back if you have anything going on in your life. that you'd like to share with a shepherd. Now, if you want to get baptized, I'll still be up here. We'd love to celebrate that. So prayer needs, we'll go to the back. If you want to get baptized, you'll come to the front. I'd like you to show this, I'd like you to watch this video highlighting a few stories about people that have gone before our shepherds, and then also highlighting a few comments from our shepherds about how deeply they care about this church family. Let's watch this video.
I can think of a few different times where I've come to one of the elders and asked for advice and wisdom, and they gave it to me freely and in a loving way.
Well, we came here in 2019, and a single mom with a teenage boy realized immediately that the youth group was huge. And I saw that my son could get lost. I need to tell somebody about my son. They need to know, do they know him? I talked to Jenny Jones just so she would know. And I said I'd like an elder to be present so that he knows our family story. And Max Pope walked into the room. He was immediately friendly and kind and a listener, and I wasn't intimidated. I felt very comfortable telling him our story. To know that Max sort of maybe had an eye on him, it just gave me comfort. That's what a mother's heart needs, to know that their son is okay when they're not present.
We were married for 9 years, and on November 20th of 2018, he was diagnosed with ALS, and he passed away 5 months later on April 6th. He went from being able to walk to not being able to breathe during that time, and it was very difficult to see him in so much pain. Cooking and cleaning and errands and taking kids to all their different activities became almost impossible. And so my MRCC family just really stepped in and provided me a lot of support, and I met Julie and Robert 4 days after I buried him. They bring me dinner, they invite me into their home. They text me just asking about how I'm doing, asking, is there anything that you need? Is there anything that we can pray for? It just means everything. Just to not let me sink, to not let me be forgotten, to let me know that there are people, no matter how bad life can be, they find a way to bring joy into my life.
I got the CT scan and sometime in September, I got an email that I had my report in there, and so I opened it up. Right renal carcinoma, large mass, has moved to the adrenal glands and the lymph nodes in my chest. I was freaking out. I didn't know what to do.
We needed to tell our class and ask for prayer. I got a text, do we have your permission to reach out to Dan Waugh and maybe get this started and anoint Brad, just like it is in Scripture, to kick off his fight. And we had a full-blown service going with the men of our class leading some singing.
Everybody got around us, they got down on their knees, and they brought the oils Dan and Robin did from the Holy Lands.
And Jason Gardner comes straight toward us, and we're just both kind of speechless and so appreciative and so humbled. I said, thank you so much. I don't think I've ever seen anything more powerful than the elders of our church going to the Father on our behalf. And he said, Holly, I don't think that there's anything more important than we do than to pray for you. Go to the Father for you.
To know that someone loves me enough to spend time in prayer over the things that are broken in my life just gives me a peace beyond anything.
I think the opportunity to pray is something that is a real honor. It doesn't have to be a time of feeling like judgment. It doesn't have to be a time that makes you want to be embarrassed or anything like that. We can pray together and it not be something that has to be anything other than just someone speaking with you to God.
The biggest subject, the most important subject of any elders meeting is praying for the people of this church.
If people are struggling with illness, with failures, that's okay. That's where God comes, He meets us there and He says, I forgive you. And so I want to be with people and meet them where they are and present our request to God. And I think I would encourage people not to be afraid of that. I'm a sinner as well as all of us. We're going to walk together in prayer and lay our difficulties, struggles at the feet of Jesus together.
They represent everything that Jesus called the elders of a church to do.
I guarantee you that if you talk to any one of our shepherds, they're just regular humans. and they're very caring and very intentional.
Dan tells me that they pray for me a lot in the elders meetings, and I feel it. If they can do it for me, then they'll do it for anybody.
I hope you know how much our shepherds care about you. And so we're about to sing, and we're going to practice here. And remember, the next few minutes are really important. God's going to do some heart work on some of you in the pews as you release your anxiety to the Lord. Some of you might need to go back and pray with our shepherds. Gary Perkins and Ben Knowles are going to be standing at the two atriums, and they're happy to pray with anybody that needs to be prayed for. And then if you want to get baptized, I'd love you to come talk to me about that down front. And if possible, stay in the room for this song. That way we can honor the work that God's going to do for just the next few minutes. Let's stand and sing.